on the titles until Trent read that out. Note to self, shorter title, 3 slogans words. Thanks, Jane. Thank you for being here today, and it's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to you today, particularly about emotional awareness. Obviously, as a clinical psychologist, it's one of my passions, but I also find that within climate change, we can so often be within our problem-solving mind that our emotions tend to get neglected a little bit, lost or unattended to, yet they still remain under the surface and we feel them anyway. And so today is a bit of an opportunity to speak about emotions, the function of emotions, but also to, rather than kind of focusing on people out there in the community, just to focus on us in this room. So we're going to make it a little bit experiential today too. I'm going to be a very cliched psychologist and ask you how you're feeling. Not yet, but soon. But don't be afraid. It's all going to be okay. I also, wanted to say how proud I am to be a community member within the Darebin Council. I'm really excited that they've taken this climate emergency mode and declaration. It makes me, but with that, I feel very proud, but with that it comes that we actually are now having to talk about the elephant that has been in the room for a very, very long time. Who was it, Giselle, who said to meet the tiger in the eye, face the tiger in the eye. And so this, for me personally, brings up mixed feelings, both of, a renewed sense of hope and determination and courage that we're doing this as a collective, as a community, but also a huge sense of uncertainty. It means I have to face the grief around what we're losing, what we've lost, and a lot of, how is this going to impact me? My parents are interstate. Does this mean I'm going to have to travel less? Yes. If this is an emergency, that is one of the restrictions. So it kind of brings up a lot of tensions, which we're going to be talking about today. And it's no surprise, that we're having a conference about this, because it feels like it's taken decades to get people on board with climate change, if not more than decades. And so it's kind of really understandable now that we're quite sensitive and a little bit apprehensive, now that we've got people on board with the climate change idea. How are they going to respond to hearing that it's actually an emergency? We are fearful of pushing people away now that we've got them in. And this, for me, even with my family and friends, is an issue of contention. Everyone within my circle of family and friends, including my dad, who is a staunch Liberal, he was the CFO of mining and mineral companies, didn't believe in global warming. Now he does. But we can't talk about the emergency. So this is a really challenging subject, and we're going to be examining it a little bit today from our own perspectives. So just a little bit about who we are. So I am a clinical psychologist and I work part-time with the Alfred, mostly for the past 8 years helping people who have serious mental illness, so providing psychological treatment, but more recently working with a statewide problem gambling and mental health service. So I get to travel rurally around Victoria, which is a huge insight into the different challenges and vulnerabilities within rural communities. But also I volunteer with Psychology for a Safe Climate, and this is an organisation whose voice I'm representing today, and who, as a group, we sat down and we thought about this subject around personal mobilisation. So hopefully I'll be able to add a little piece to the puzzle today of this challenge that we're facing from our group's perspective. What we do has kind of shifted and changed over the years. We're founded in, Carol rides down here. She's the founder of PSC. Put your hand up, Carol. Say hello. You! Many of you already know Carol. She is an incredible woman and full of power, courage, determination, grit, perseverance, and always someone that you can talk to about those deep, dark feelings. So we do many things, but at the moment, I guess our main focus is around acknowledging again and again that climate change is not just an intellectual issue, it's an emotional issue as well. And that we know psychologically that when we don't pay attention to our emotions, when we don't tend to them or give them air to breathe, we can remain stuck. So these are there's this phrase, what we resist will persist. We know this very well with climate change. We've resisted it understandably for a long time, but it also goes for our emotions. And so a lot of the work we're doing at the moment is to run workshops where we allow people to give space and voice to their emotions. We know once we start talking about our emotions, it activates this different part of our brain, the frontal lobe, and that actually helps us regulate our emotions. So giving words to them, helping express and make sense of what we're feeling, but also to connect with each other, to bring in a sense of common humanity, which is the antidote to social isolation and loneliness, which is very common in anxiety and depression. So there are different functions to our workshops. We actually have 2 workshops coming up, and we've got some flyers just at the back, but you can also look them up on our website and Facebook page. So we also have a few publications. Again, they're just at the back corner, and you can download them from our website. Now, before I kind of launch into the nitty-gritty of the talk today, I really wanted to just pay tribute to the work that's been going on out there, trying to collate the growing body of literature and evidence on the mental health and health side effects of climate change. These are just 2 documents. They kind of bring in together a lot of different studies and research about where we're at, and they're both very recent. We've got one of the authors of this article. Does this have a... Oh, it does. There, I love these things when you can point to stuff. Susie Burke, who's just in the front row here. So if you did want to talk about anything around the mental health consequences or connections of climate change, both direct from, extreme weather events, but also indirect around our sense of fear, our anticipated loss of control, that despair that we feel. These are really handy documents to go to. But perhaps what we're talking about today is the elephant in the room, and I guess I wanted to mention or reflect on why is climate change such an emotionally difficult subject, and there are many reasons, but possibly one that's definitely was reflected in the talks that we had this morning, but something that as a group we reflect on a lot is that climate change raises so many tensions. It becomes a very polarising subject, and it's fueled by our brain's natural inclination to categorise. If I say up, you think down. If I say T, you think... we're very good at splitting things into groups. And so if we think about climate change, even just today, some of the tensions that have been raised, the business as usual, keeping the peace and disruption, easy change versus hard change, the tension between being active and reflecting, incremental and transformational change, hope and despair, systems, individuals, conservative, radical, us, them. So we both want to accept the problem is an emergency, but we wish it weren't true. We both are part of the problem and of the solution. We want the system to change, but we desperately want it to stay the same. So many of these tensions are also paradoxical in nature, like sometimes we need to slow down to speed up, or sometimes the hardest thing to do is actually the easiest. Or sometimes in order to get someone on board, we need to kind of stand back and give them space to move towards us. So when we experience these tensions, the risk is that they are perceived as mutually exclusive, as in competition with each other. And this is particularly apparent when 2 people hold one of the either tensions between incremental or transformational change. It can become a competition with each other. Yet fundamentally, there is truth to both sides. And I think our task as people who are trying to make sense of the emergency and take emergency mode action is to actually recognise when these tensions are happening within us and without, and to try to integrate and synthesise to help ourselves get unstuck. But perhaps the biggest tension in the room is that we know it's an emergency, yet we're not in full emergency mode. And I must be one of those strange mothers. I recently
had twins 2 years ago who have made me fundamentally sick all the time, including now, I've just had laryngitis, so I'm priming your care and compassion right now by telling you this story. But I'm even more worried about climate change, even in those early days. I was trying, I guess it was on my mind a lot, and it was also maybe because I'm used to talking about it on the minds of the women in my mother's group. So I think there are parents out there who, yes, it's the tension between dealing with the everyday demand and also keeping in mind the suffering that's happening in the world and community, and not either. So we're still coming to terms with the scale and urgency, and we know that incremental change is absolutely essential, but it's not sufficient. And so what does transformational change mean for our lives? But I think even beneath all of this, the mother of all emotional challenges, and one that's, I think, spoken more and more within the public realm, is that climate change is an existential threat. It's been mentioned here already that humanity as it's known will potentially be no more. So this issue of the climate emergency does, even if we don't prime it, it will raise questions about the survival of humanity, not to mention the current quality of our lives. And this is, if we stop to think about it, truly horrifying, even unthinkable. And existential crises are not unique to climate change. Mark Epstein, who's a psychiatrist, mindfulness Buddhist teacher, has said in one of his books that trauma is not just a result of major disasters. It does not only happen to some people, an undercurrent of it runs through ordinary life. There is no way to be alive without being conscious of the potential for disaster. One way or another, death and its cousins of old age, illness, accidents, separations, loss, and I would add becoming a parent. I've never thought of doing a will before, but here I am. This death, it hangs over all of us. Nobody is immune. And so what I'm trying to highlight is not potentially that we have to panic about the inevitable passing of all of our lives, but that we do have experience in this. There are existential psychologists, work. We are all thinking and living and breathing this existential crisis in one way or another. The fear is that we naturally incline away, avoid or suppress it in some way, and as I said before, what we resist will persist. And the antidote to that is what we feel we can heal. So that's the tension that we're working towards. Now, this is the big question, the million-dollar question: how do we mobilise ourselves when in an emergency? And there is quite a lot of literature out there already for psychological first aid and individual mobilisation in an emergency. And I think it was Jane Morton who said, we know that emergencies can bring people together. It actually is possible to feel fear, but also stay centred and strong and focused on the task. So we don't necessarily have to become paralysed when we experience fear if we are resourced. So today, as I said, rather than focusing out how we're going to mobilise all those other people who aren't in this room, we're going to think about how we mobilise ourselves. And so I'd like to pause here for a moment and find a buddy next to you, or if you're in a row of three, that's okay too. And I just want us to reflect on a particular question that our group, when we met, when we were thinking about, well, how the hell do we mobilise people? What are we doing here? One of our group members said, well, I'm not even sure I like this emergency thing. To me, it's like sirens and ambulances. For him, that's what emergency represented. So we realised we had to take a step back and actually understand for us as individuals, what is this climate emergency that we face? So this is the first experiential task I'd like us to play around with. It's going to be really quick, so don't overthink it. What I'd like you to do is get into pairs, have person A talk about, for them, how do I feel about the climate emergency? So what does being in an emergency actually mean to you? What memories, images, what comes to mind when you actually think of an emergency? And person A just listens. You don't even have to like validate or acknowledge. Just listen, be open, be there, be present. And we're just going to spend 30 seconds on sharing, and then we're going to swap. So it's like a minute activity. I'll just share a few reflections from what we discovered when we did this activity, albeit we had a little bit more time. Well, the first thing to note, actually I'll go to this phrase, is that the word emergency is absolutely loaded with meaning, personal meaning, imposed on it to the person hearing it, their life experiences, and that this may influence how they feel about it and what actions they take and their different responses. So these are some of the different responses within our group. And from that, I guess it's important to acknowledge that climate change emergency will elicit a whole gamut of emotions, and sometimes more than one emotion, and contradictory emotions. And on one particular day, in that day you might have 5 different things that you're feeling about it. So it changes. And this is something to, I guess, understand fundamentally about emotions, that we can't actually choose. This is such a Freudian slip. It's got, we choose how we feel. Oh. I wish we could choose how we feel, although I would probably be out of a job. So lucky we can't. We can't always choose how we feel. And no matter how much I want to feel something, I can't just force it on myself if I want to feel happy when someone close to me has just died. It's just not a choice. There are some emotions that we cannot help but we can't avoid. And so this is important because sometimes we worry about activating a particular emotional response in someone, and that becomes our focus in that interaction, as opposed to how just trying to engage them with some kind of care, compassion, kindness, because the emotions are going to be there anyway. We can feel contradictory emotions, that not all emotions are mutually exclusive, and in fact they are layered. So we might be feeling intense rage or anger when underneath that is hurt. We might experience 2 completely opposite emotions at the same time. If someone we know gets an award that we're up for, we might feel both incredibly happy for that person and their achievements, yet a pang of envy, and then we might feel bad for having that envious thoughts, and then we add guilt to that and shame, and it goes on. Important to note here is that emotions aren't inherently good or bad, that each has a function. Emotions, yes, some are painful and some are pleasant and some are neutral, but no one particular emotion is evil or to be rid of. Each has a function, and typically the function fits within 3 categories. The first, to organise or to motivate our actions. So guilt urges us to recognise that we've made a transgression, to repair, to make a commitment not to do that same mistake. Fear organises us to protect ourselves from threat, and so on. The second function is that emotions communicate to others, communicate what's important to us, what needs to be focused on. And the third function is that emotions communicate to ourselves. They validate ourselves, that we actually are meant to be feeling this within this particular situation because it makes sense. So emotions, however, can be expressed in helpful or unhelpful ways, and this is where that fear around if we activate a threat response, we might become paralysed and not act, and this is fundamentally linked to how well we're resourced, which I'll be talking about soon. The other point that we discovered was that climate change is perhaps, the emergency word is perhaps quite nuanced, because we're not just talking about an acute emergency right here, right now, we're talking about a chronic emergency, and then we're talking about acute on chronic emergencies. So it's very vast, and this is perhaps one of the the pitfalls of using a label to describe the problem that we're in. So we're not saying that it's an emergency to make someone feel threatened or fearful. We're using the word emergency because it describes the problem that we're in. And as psychologists, I'm quite used to using labels. In mental health, we use labels all the time: depression, anxiety, psychosis, personality disorder. All of these labels are shorthand ways of describing particular phenomenology. Yet you can have 3 people sitting in the room with depression, and they look completely different. Their experiences are completely different. There will be common threads, but there's diversity within that one word. So this is not to, get rid of the label. It's just to be aware of the tension between using one or two words and describing using a lot of words, and that sometimes we need to just find what that balance is. Using one particular word, the risk is that we can fall into the pitfalls of labelling, like polarising. We either like or we don't like that word. We lose depth of meaning for the actual experience and so on. So I want to talk about resources for the rest of this talk. And to frame it within a particular model, it's the stress vulnerability model. It's very common within psychological practice. And it basically says the way our day goes is based on three broad factors: the challenges that we face, the vulnerabilities that we bring into those challenges, and the resources we have. So if our resources are under proportionate to the challenges we face, we're more likely to experience stress, distress, and overwhelm. It's very simple, but it's a good little formula. And then you can break it down into different aspects. So we've got challenges in the world, in our body, and in our mind. So we've got, environmental challenges in the world. We've got maybe disease or difficulty in our body, but we also might have anxiety or depression in the mind, and so on. You can fit all the different factors in here. And so this kind of gives you different areas of intervention for your own lives. But as a psychologist, I'm particularly interested in the area of the mind and resourcing the mind, because I find that often we're pretty good at problem-solving challenges and trying to decrease our vulnerabilities by looking after our health and sleeping well, etc. Well, not with toddlers, but, acceptance, which is an inner resource. So we're going to talk about what are these inner resources. So the inner resources are connected, and this is Rick Hanson's work, and he's got a really fabulous website, lots of free training, good podcast, but it's based on the principles of brain science, neuroplasticity, and Paul Gilbert also does a lot of this work. But the three fundamental psychological needs are based around safety, satisfaction, and connection. So safety is the most primitive, basic psychological need, and that's based right in the fight, flight, freeze, the amygdala part of our brain. And so, I guess the main point here is that what we want to do is try to resource ourselves so when our safety is threatened, whether it's direct, real, or imagined, like our sense of self is threatened and we're experiencing self-criticism and attack, that we have the resources to stay centred, strong, and respond, as opposed to moving into a reactive kind of red zone. If you think about red zone, green zone, we want to stay in the green zone even when we're facing threat. So satisfaction or drive system, I'm going to just get to my notes, is linked in with, I'll just link it back to this. So this is the three parts. So this is the safety part, the satisfaction, and the connections, activating different parts of our brain. And this drive part is really in our culture something that's overvalued. So the drive part is very important for motivation, for satisfaction, for recognition, but when overactivated, as Gilbert and Schroeder note, it's our excitement and drive system, our competitive psychology, that will gobble up the Earth's resources if allowed to. And then the other more recent development in our brain is the connection system, and I think this is the part that is perhaps underutilised or under-resourced, that if we fear how bad we're saying, particularly around my friends, I fear saying how bad it is because I worry about being rejected, being isolated, being judged. All of those things disconnect me. So the problems can arise when these three systems are out of balance, or when we are activating one of these systems and we fall into our red zone and we feel like we're reactive. So red zone within the connection system would be around feeling isolated, disconnected, different from other people, strange, weird, alone. and activation of the fight, flight, freeze system. In the red zone would be hiding away, freezing, shutting down, rigid thinking, inflexibility, and difficulty within the drive system would lead to red zone behaviours would be like drinking to cope with emotions, or gambling, or other